Hello everyone, I'm back with another Jane Eyre adaptation comparison, part 2 of the attack on Mason, or the second half of the book's chapter 20. We're picking up immediately where we left off. The doctor has come and tended to Mason's wounds, and now he's taking him away from Thornfield back to his place to recover. It's been a long, crazy night, and thinking that Rochester's done with her, Jane turns to go back inside, but instead, he asks her to take a walk with him. The orchard at dawn is picturesque, with flowers and trees and birds, and after the gothic horror and mystery of the last few hours, it's a welcome breath of fresh air. This is their first truly relaxed moment alone together since the night of the fire. Rochester's unexpected departure, then his return with his guests, and then Mason's arrival have all kept them apart. Potentially things could now be a little strange between them, especially on Jane's part, where she believes, as everyone else does, that he's courting Blanche Ingram. But instead of any awkwardness, there's that sense of ease and companionship again, as if nothing's changed. There are a few major facets to this conversation. Number 1, Jane says the line, "I like to serve you, sir, and to obey you in all that is right." Further discussion ensues, hearkening back to their conversation right after Mason's arrival, of how Jane would respond if Rochester asked her to do something that she felt was wrong. Number 2 is Rochester's "I'll put a case to you" speech. Rochester gives Jane a not-so-hypothetical situation, asking her what she would do in his position. He speaks of committing, quote, "a capital error, mind I don't say a crime," and then after years of misery, someone comes into his life, someone good and bright who has the power to regenerate him. Would it be right, he asks, to defy convention and custom to be with this person? Jane replies that, quote, "a sinner's reformation should never depend on a fellow creature," a sentiment I wholeheartedly agree with, by the way. A relationship should not be built on the foundation that one individual is going to save the other. Jane says Rochester should look to a higher power, and Rochester comes back with his justification that God has ordained the instrument. This is all major foreshadowing, and I feel it's really the main point of this conversation. Number 3, just before Rochester identifies this special someone, his eager tone abruptly changes, and he names Blanche Ingram, asking Jane sarcastically if she doesn't think that Miss Ingram would, quote, "regenerate him with a vengeance." I always get a kick out of that line. As I go through the different versions, we're going to see that this is something the adaptations differ on, how Blanche comes into the conversation, which one of them brings her up first, how Rochester reacts. And number 4, Rochester asks Jane if she will stay up and watch with him again the night before he is married. Only 2 versions, 1944 and 1997, include this part, surprisingly. Maybe most of the others took it out because, well, it makes Rochester seem like kind of a jerk. Now, in the adaptations, this scene varies quite a bit, especially in terms of length. It's not as essential as some other scenes, so I think writers felt they were free to change it up if they so desired. Some interpretations are short, some are long, a couple versions skip the scene entirely, and one version changes it into another scene. So, this should be interesting. Once again, we're leaving out the 1934 version because it doesn't have this scene. That brings us to 1944. I like the scene in this adaptation. After the dark, oppressive mood of the previous scene, this is a nice change of pace. Rochester is more buoyant than we've seen him lately, and he and Jane demonstrate that friendly bond that I'm always on the lookout for. The script touches on all the right notes, although Charlotte Bronte's dialogue isn't recreated in its entirety. None of the adaptations recreate this scene in its entirety, but with a feature-length film, I think this is about the best you can hope for, and the dialogue is beautifully delivered. I think Wells does a good job capturing Rochester's eagerness when he's asking Jane for her opinion regarding his not-so-hypothetical question. He seems less like he's just looking for her approval, more like he's genuinely unsure what to do. The addition of this line makes me think so.
"If you're afraid that you may bring shame to what you most cherish or destroy what you most desire to protect."
Rochester does not refer to Blanche by name here, but the scene does end with the appearance not of 2 male guests, as in the book, but of Blanche, accompanied by Adele. So even though Rochester and Jane don't speak directly of him marrying her, her presence on the scene connects the dots. The 1970 version starts off well. I mean, it's not perfect. As I mentioned last time, Rochester brings Mason to the doctor himself, so Jane paces around the lawn waiting for his return. He does finally come back, surprised that she's still up and assuring her that all's well and there's no danger. They discuss Mason's character a bit. This version, 73 and 83, are the only ones to go into that, and as Rochester tells his story, Jane leans forward and hangs on his every word. It's when he says, "And then he meets a woman," that she closes her eyes and withdraws, her expression turning to one of dread. She's the one who mentions Blanche in this case, and he turns to look at her with amusement. He actually asks Jane if she doesn't like her, and Jane replies that she doesn't think Blanche is for him. That's pretty bold. Everything's going fine, pretty much according to book, and then he says, "You've grown attached to Thornfield. Would it grieve you to leave it?" And I'm like, hey, they took that line from later on. And then she starts getting emotional and says, "Do you think because I'm poor and plain that I have no feelings?" And I'm like, whoa! What are you doing, movie? It's not time for that yet. I've only seen this version once, and that was 4 years ago, so I completely forgot that this version jumps straight from the attack on Mason to the proposal scene. We won't be talking about that for months! And when I do, trust me, it's gonna be like an hour-long video. Oh my goodness. So that puts an end to the discussion of the 1970 version. On to 1973! The scene starts with a lot more energy than other versions. Rochester offers Jane his hand and then pulls her along as he runs into the orchard. That's fun. This and 2011 are the only ones that include a flower, but as all devoted 73 fans are aware, this is the only one where Rochester says the line, "Jane, will you have a flower?" This is arguably the most picturesque of these scenes. It's a sunny day, the birds are chirping, the daffodils are plentiful. I notice in this scene that as they're walking, Rochester has a tendency to plunge ahead like he's lost in his thoughts, and then he glances behind and slows down to let her catch up. Even this manner of walking, I think, is in keeping with Jaston's overall portrayal. I appreciate that Rochester doesn't just brush away her concerns here, like, "Oh, don't you worry your little head about all that." He's not being completely honest, but he's answering her questions as truthfully as he feels he's able. Rochester's tonal shift here when he mentions Blanche Ingram is very close to the way I picture it in the book, and this is the only version where Jane explicitly says his redemption shouldn't depend on another person, and Rochester argues that God ordains the instrument. All in all, this scene is pretty close to the way it should be. Not entirely accurate, but it has a lot of things the others don't have. I'll point out here that 1973 and 1983 are the only ones where Rochester calls Jane his pet lamb. I realize that out of context that probably sounds a little strange, but you all know what I'm talking about. The 1983 version starts off and I'm just thinking, ugh, these two are so stinking cute together. And the way Dalton says, "It's been a strange night for you, Jane," and looks down at her as he delivers these lines is super endearing. Unlike what I said about the last version, Rochester here is dismissive of her worries about Grace Poole. Not that he's annoyed, like in 1997, or doesn't care what she has to say, he just wants her to stop worrying and asking questions about what happened. In a major departure from the book and all other versions, Rochester interrupts the conversation, or changes the subject, by insisting that it's cold and she needs some food. So they go back in the house and apparently make a pit stop to get some brandy and biscuits. For breakfast? I would have loved a scene of them sneaking into the kitchen, by the way. Maybe not in a Jane Eyre adaptation, it really doesn't fit. But as a fanfiction scene, perhaps, Rochester rummaging around in the cabinets, trying to find things, getting a ton of food because he wants Jane to have lots of choices and he wants to fill her up, and Jane protesting that it's way too much. Aww. So the rest of the conversation is moved indoors, and yes, it is a bit of a letdown to have taken them out of the fresh air. Have you ever noticed how many of their conversations take place outside? That said, though, there is something intimate about this setting. This is the only version where Rochester asks her to sit by him, and when she hesitates, asks her if it would be wrong. Granted, in the book it's a bench, and here it's a sofa, plus in the book she's fully dressed, and here she's still in her night clothes, but still, only adaptation. This version retains more of Rochester's speech than any other, making this the longest rendition of this scene. And really, how could she have any doubt about who he's referring to? The way he's looking at her and speaking so ardently, more like a lover than an employer asking for moral advice. He finally seems to figure out from her downcast eyes and troubled, inquiring look that she's not quite on the same wavelength as him, so he starts laughing and walks away, and that's when he brings up Blanche Ingram. And wow, Dalton nails the sarcasm here when he talks about her. This is the only version in which Rochester calls Blanche a real strapper. I have never had any idea what that meant, and that's always bothered me. So I looked it up finally, and the first result I got said that it's British Australian slang for someone who holds a position looking after racehorses. Obviously that's not what we're looking for, but dictionary.com defines it first as a person or thing that straps, which doesn't make any sense, and second as a large, robust person. Here we go. Rochester follows up the term strapper by calling her big, brown, and buxom. So that's the ticket. I'm so relieved that I finally straightened that out. The 1996 adaptation doesn't have this scene, so I guess we'll skip it this time. In the 1997 version, they've got a little damage control to do. In the last couple scenes, Rochester wasn't terribly appealing, so now it's like they're doing everything they can to make him romantic again. It's a slow thaw. Rochester starts out still abrasive and imperious, but gradually becomes less so, even thanking her for helping him with Mason. Is it Jane's calming, sympathetic presence working its magic? This is the second scene in a row in this version where, instead of answering his question, Jane just stands there and gazes at him, telling us in a moony voiceover how much she loves him. Blech. However, she does say the line, "He made me love him without even realizing it," so I guess they get a point for that, even though it's out of place. Interestingly, this is the second longest version of this scene. Jane and Rochester have a theological dispute. It's not quite the way the discussion goes in the book. Jane tells Rochester that in his shoes she would look to a higher plane for forgiveness, and in return he scoffs, "Brocklehurst's teaching, no doubt. When has God ever done anything for me? If I wait for him, I'll wait forever." You win some, you lose some with this version of the scene. It does have some of their nicer moments as they watch the sun rise, helping to restore the viewer's good opinion of Rochester. He even apologizes, as he's supposed to, for keeping her up, and right at the end he seems to be on the verge of making a declaration. They're having a little moment, and then he speaks of getting married soon, and she tugs her hand out of his grasp. She's the one who mentions Blanche. Rochester pauses for a second, and then goes along with it, but that's pretty much the end of that conversation. The 2006 version is shockingly short. It's only about a minute long. As they watch the carriage roll away, Rochester asks Jane to stay a while outside with him, and comments that the house is a dungeon. These two really do look like they've been up all night. He's stumping around like a man beaten down, and Jane looks tired and disheveled. But Rochester really only has enough time to ask her if she was afraid before two of the guests come out and he directs her to go out the back way. It's very brief. I guess the writers felt they'd covered the gist of the material in this conversation elsewhere. The 2011 version starts the scene as Rochester leans heavily against the door, as if barring Mason and all that is associated with him out. Rochester and Jane don't really walk together. He stalks ahead and sits on some stone steps and gets straight to the point without wasting time pretending that he's telling someone else's story. I confess that the line, "You transfix me quite," which I bet is a fan favorite, has always bothered me. It just sounds awkward to my ears. But this time I think I've at least figured out where they got it from. There's a part where Rochester says, "Well, you too have power over me and may injure me, yet I dare not show you where I am vulnerable, lest faithful and friendly as you are, you should transfix me at once." So the word is in there, it does occur in this conversation, but the usage is completely different. The best part of the scene, I think, is when he seems to believe that Jane knows he's referring to her as she gives very pragmatic answers to his not-so-hypothetical question. But then she says, "And if the lady is of noble stock and has indicated that she may reciprocate," and he tilts his head and asks,
"Jane, of whom do you think I speak?"
That's not how it is in the book, but it is amusing. After that, Rochester comes closer, sticking a flower in her hair while talking to her of Blanche with an intent look in his eyes. Jane then beats a hasty retreat of her own accord, rushing off to take a breather and puzzle over the mixed messages he's sending. Okay, those are all the adaptations. It's tough to say which one's my favorite. We know that I often lean toward the most faithful, but there's no version of the scene that's entirely book accurate, reproducing the dialogue verbatim. But if we boil it down to a matter of personal preference, I think 1983 is the one I enjoy the most, strapper and all. Alright, my fellow Jane Eyre fans, that concludes the discussion of Chapter 20. I look forward to hearing your thoughts on the different interpretations of this scene. The next adaptation comparison will be the leave of absence scene, and then we're going to change gears a bit and cover some material from earlier in the book. So I hope you'll stay tuned for that, and I'll see you next time. Thanks for watching!